I remember it so clearly, the night before Thanksgiving. And yet, the kitchen felt so cold, like even the scent of cinnamon couldn't thaw the heavy, stale air hanging there. I stood in the middle of it all, wrapped in an old, faded sweater Victor never once noticed. My hands were still gripping that damp dish towel cold, heavy, like it had soaked up every ounce of my exhaustion. Victor sat at the table, eyes glued to his phone like always. The news anchor's voice from the television mixed with the relentless ticking of the clock. It all sounded sharp, disconnected, painfully loud against the silence we'd long stopped trying to break. "You forgot dessert again, Julia." His voice broke through, flat and distant, like he wasn't even speaking to me, just out loud to no one. I clenched the dish towel tighter. That towel, years ago, I'd stitched tiny rosebuds into its corners. My first little act of love when I married him. Back then, every thread held a bit of hope. Now, all that was left were faded stains and a reminder of how long I'd waited, and waited, for a man who never really saw me. I dropped the towel on the table. It made a soft sound, but in my heart, it thundered like a storm had just broken loose. I stood up straighter, looked right at Victor, and for once, he actually looked up. His eyes were blank, clueless to the storm that had been gathering inside me for years. "I'm done, Victor," I said, calm, steady, but every word echoed like a verdict. "I need my freedom." He gave me that smirk, that same dismissive, mocking smile, like I was just throwing a little tantrum. But this time, I didn't wait for him to finish. My fingers brushed a porcelain plate on the shelf just a touch and it tumbled down, shattering across the cold tile floor. That sound! It didn't hurt. It set me free. I stared at the broken pieces sparkling under the harsh kitchen light, and for the first time in years, I felt light. I didn't try to gather them back up. I didn't try to fix anything. I turned around. No tears, no regrets. Only the sound of my footsteps echoing through a house that, for the first time, I knew I was leaving. And funny thing, when I shut that door behind me and the cold night air rushed in through the crack, I felt lighter than I had in decades. That night, I wasn't the woman stuck behind a kitchen door anymore. That night, I took the first real step toward finding me. And no matter how long that journey would be, I knew when I dropped that towel, I'd already set myself free. And when the door clicked shut behind me, sealing off those broken dishes and a whole life left behind, I didn't run to anyone. I went to the only person I really needed to face myself. My feet carried me somewhere I hadn't dared stand still for years, right in front of the bathroom mirror. For the longest time, I just stood there. The steam from an earlier shower still clung to the glass, blurring the reflection. But even through the fog, I could see how much of a stranger I'd become. I reached out, wiped away a streak of condensation, and there she was, the woman I'd been avoiding for so long. Her eyes shallowed out, tired. Fine lines traced the edges like tiny roads, each one a path leading nowhere, marked by journeys that never found their destination. I leaned in closer. My fingers brushed my dry, cracked lips. When was the last time I smiled? Really smiled. Not out of politeness, not to pretend I was okay, not because someone expected it. I traced the crow's feet near my eyes. When did those show up? I used to think wrinkles came from years of laughing, but no, they also come from the long, silent nights, from holding your breath through exhaustion, from swallowing down sighs so often you forget what it's like to exhale fully. The harsh yellow light exposed every flaw, every truth. I wasn't young anymore. But what cut deeper than the years was realizing I no longer knew who that woman in the mirror was. Once, I was a dreamer. I'd sit by the window for hours, sewing tiny rosebuds into a handkerchief, dreaming of a kitchen filled with the scent of fresh apple pie and the sound of laughter. Now, that kitchen stood silent, and the only sound left was the cold clink of disappointment. I pressed my lips together, forcing back the tears, because I knew if I let them fall now, I might just convince myself to stay. Who is she? Who was I? The questions hit me like a bell tolling in the empty room. I stared hard at that reflection at those weary eyes, and then I turned away. That foggy, defeated gaze, it wouldn't be the last thing I saw. I promised myself right then and there I will find her again. The woman who smiled at the morning sun, who laughed just because the houseplants looked greener that day. But to find her, I had to leave. Fully. Completely. And as my hand slid off that cold mirror, I made a vow. Tomorrow, I wouldn't just dream about freedom. I'd live it. And no matter how long that road would be, I was already walking it. After that long night standing in front of the mirror, facing myself for the first time in years, I knew I couldn't just make promises to my reflection and stay trapped behind those familiar walls. The next morning, I let my feet decide where to go. That's how I found myself at a little cafe tucked away on a quiet street corner, the kind of place where the smell of cinnamon rolls dances gently through the air and the hum of the coffee machine feels almost like a lullaby. The scent drifted slow and easy, curling its way into my chest before I even stepped through the door. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I sighed. Laura was already there, sitting alone at a corner table, her small frame somehow lost and perfectly at home all at once in the cozy space. But those eyes still burned with the same fierce clarity they always had, like she could see through every layer I'd tried to hide behind. She didn't ask why I'd called her. She didn't bother with small talk. She simply slid a cup of black coffee across the table to minnow cream. No sugar, just like she knew bitter was the only thing I could stomach right then. "You look more tired than the last time I saw you, Julia," she said softly, her voice light, almost like smoke curling from a just snuffed-out candle. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, feeling the heat seep into my fingers, clinging to it like it was the last warmth I had left. "You probably think I'm weak, don't you?" I muttered, my eyes locked on the swirling black coffee, too ashamed to meet hers. Laura didn't answer right away. She never did when she knew the question wasn't really the question. She adjusted the silver bracelet on her wrist and exhaled slowly, like she was weighing every word before it left her mouth. "Divorce," she started, her voice low and steady, each word deliberate. "It's not always the escape people think it is. But running away? That's never freedom either." Her words landed like stones dropped into a still lake sinking fast, leaving ripples that reached every corner of my heart. And I realized it wasn't Victor's cold words that had been weighing me down. It wasn't the half-finished divorce papers tucked away in my drawer. It was fear. The fear that once I walked away, I'd just end up standing lost at some unfamiliar crossroad, too scared to take another step. Laura placed her hand gently over mine. Her fingers were cool, steady, her eyes unwavering. "Julia," she said quietly, "you can walk as far as you want, but if you don't stop and really face yourself, you'll never feel like you belong anywhere." And right there, in that little cafe filled with the smell of burnt coffee and warm cinnamon, I let the tears fall. For the first time in days, I didn't fight them. And somehow, amidst the mess of it all, I felt my heart beat slow. Right then, I understood freedom wouldn't be found out there, in some far-off place. It had to start exactly where I was. With every broken piece still lying on the floor, I walked back into that house just as the clock struck 6, like I always did, as if my body hadn't figured out yet that everything was different now. The kitchen lights cast their usual soft yellow glow over the cracked, peeling walls, the same old walls I could trace with my eyes closed. Dinner was laid out neat, precise, and completely devoid of life. Cold slices of ham, soup Victor always requested but never once complimented, and that damn apple pie, sitting there, untouched and as cold as the November air creeping in through the cracked window. Victor sat at the head of the table, his back perfectly straight, his eyes locked on his phone. His fingers scrolled endlessly, probably reading market forecasts or news that didn't matter anything to avoid acknowledging the woman sitting right across from him. I pulled out my chair and sat down, my heart heavier than the silence filling the room. The tablecloth caught my eye, faded, patterned with tiny turkeys and autumn leaves. I bought it years ago, told myself it was for special occasions. And now? What occasion could possibly feel less special than this? Victor let out a soft sigh, like even the air I breathed was a burden to him. "You forgot to turn on the heater," he muttered, still not looking at me. "How's anyone supposed to eat in this icebox?" His words hung there, colder than the draft swirling in through the cracked window pane. I looked down at the table, at the fancy china my mother-in-law gave us as a wedding gift, beautiful plates reserved for moments worth remembering. And now they were just silent witnesses to the end of everything. The sharp clink of silverware cut through the air like glass shattering, every scrape and clatter echoing louder than any argument we'd ever had. And that was it. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the old tile floor, its harsh screech, a declaration all its own. Victor finally looked up, startled. But just as quickly, his expression settled back into that familiar, dismissive indifference. "What now, Julia?" he asked, exasperated, like I was just another chore left undone. I didn't answer. I didn't owe him my voice anymore. I'd played the scene too many times, stood up, only to be pulled back down by half-hearted apologies, by promises folded neatly between lukewarm soup and a cold, tired touch. Not tonight. I walked straight out of the dining room, left that door swinging shut behind me, left the dinner to grow cold one final time. My steps felt impossibly heavy, and yet, somehow, lighter than they'd ever been. Laura was right. You can't walk forward until you face what's really inside. And standing there in the hallway, I knew this table, this house, this life, it wasn't home anymore. And this time, I wasn't turning back. Not for anything. I sat quietly in the bedroom, the kind of silence so thick you could almost hear it. Outside, the wind howled against the old window panes, and the soft, warm glow of the bedside lamp spilled over a blank piece of paper waiting for my decision. The old suitcase sat by the dresser, its zipper frayed, edges worn thin just like me, weathered, patched together, and still unable to decide. Was it time to finally close this chapter? My hand trembled as I picked up the pen. The words were already printed in bold, cold letters at the top. Petition for divorce. Everything was right there, lined up neatly, like a decision I'd already made if only I had the courage to finish it. I tried to write my name. Julia Anderson. The letters wobbled, uneven and shaky, like my breath as I struggled to steady my hand. I never imagined my own signature could feel this heavy, like it weighed more than my entire body. I set the pen down and leaned back, my eyes falling to the far corner of the room where our old wedding photo still sat, frozen in time, watching me. That photo had become nothing more than a silent, bitter reminder. Victor was probably in the living room right now, nursing a glass of whiskey, sinking into that old recliner like nothing in the world had changed. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel obligated to walk out there and tidy up his mess, or smooth over the tension with a few soft words. Is freedom really just a signature away? I exhaled slowly and folded the draft carefully this time, not crumpled in frustration like all the times before. Because deep down I knew, whether I signed it today or not, that piece of paper was a door I could open whenever I was ready. But maybe, just maybe, what I really needed to find first wasn't the way out of this marriage. It was the way back to me. I stood up and walked out onto the balcony. The night air hit me sharp and cold, but somewhere in that bite of winter wind, I felt something stir. A quiet awakening. Like the earth itself was holding its breath for one tiny sliver of sunlight to break through the frost. And I knew I wouldn't sign it tonight. But tomorrow, I'd start writing my own story again, whether I still carried the name Anderson or left it behind. And for the first time in a long time, I took a deep, full breath just for me. I tucked the paper away, slid it deep into the drawer like I was setting aside a door I wasn't quite ready to walk through. But my feet, they'd already started moving. The next morning, I walked down South Street, past the bare, brittle trees lined up like tired old sentinels, silent and still, just like I'd been for far too long. I dragged a small suitcase behind me. I wasn't running away. I wasn't going anywhere far. I just needed to see if I still had it in me to move. And wouldn't you know it, life has a funny way of testing you the moment you try to change. Right there, at the corner by the old bakery, I ran straight into Linda Carter. She hadn't changed one bit. That perfect, polished hair, her heels clicking against the pavement with all the confidence in the world. Linda Carter was the kind of woman who could make you feel small with nothing more than a glance. She stopped, her eyes flicking down to the scuffed old suitcase at my side. A slow, knowing smirk tugged at her lips. Well, well. Another woman off chasing freedom with a suitcase full of false hope? She drawled, her voice light as air but sharp enough to cut through bone. My fingers tightened around the handle of the suitcase. Yesterday, those words would have crushed me. But today, I almost laughed. I looked her straight in the eye. My voice didn't shake. "No, Linda, I'm not running away," I said, my tone calm and sure, like I'd finally set something down I'd been carrying for years. "I'm going to find myself." Linda raised a perfectly plucked eyebrow. She wasn't used to that kind of peace coming from me. She gave a little shrug and turned on her heel, tossing one final parting shot over her shoulder. "Good luck with that, Julia. Just remember the world out there's colder than you think." I watched her disappear behind a row of foggy storefront windows. She wasn't wrong. The world out there was cold. But at least it wasn't as cold as those silent, bitter dinners in my own home. And for the first time in, God, I don't even know how long, I didn't feel left behind. I wasn't standing there watching someone else walk away. I was the one walking forward. And I didn't care where I was headed because this time, I wasn't leaving to escape something. I was walking toward me. Linda faded into the distance, her heels clicking away like some final punctuation mark at the end of an old story. And with every clack of my suitcase wheels over the broken pavement, I realized no road to peace is ever smooth. But at least now, I was moving. The apartment sat quietly on the third floor of a worn-down building. The hallway stretched long and dim, smelling faintly of peeling paint and a trace of coffee drifting from someone's open kitchen down the hall. My door was simple, just a small metal number, 3B. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't perfect. But it was enough. Enough to shut out the world. Enough to hear my own thoughts again. I slid the key into the lock, and when it clicked open, it felt almost like the room itself had been waiting to welcome me home. The door swung open, and sunlight poured through a wide, uncovered window, warm and soft, like an embrace I'd been aching for far too long. The space was nearly empty, just a twin bed tucked against the wall, a set of beige curtains that had clearly seen better days, and that glorious open window, letting in the cool November air. I set the suitcase down. The sound of it hitting the floor echoed loud and certain. "I'm here," it seemed to say. I really made it. The rustle of leaves swirled just outside, blending with the faint scent of aged wood and sunlight. I stood in the middle of the room and took a long, full breath-in. No one rushed, no one interrupted, no one criticized for being too loud, too soft, too anything. It doesn't have to be big. It just has to be mine. I walked over to the window. Across the way, I spotted tiny pots of green lined up on the sill of the apartment opposite mine, their little leaves fluttering bravely in the breeze. And I smiled. Maybe I'd get a plant too. Something small, something alive. A simple reminder that no matter how fragile a start might be, it's still worthy of growing. I lay down on the thin mattress, still carrying the faint smell of new fabric, and exhaled. No Victor. No cold dinners. No judging eyes. Just me. And for now, that was enough. I closed my eyes and let the sunlight dance across my skin through those worn-out curtains, reaching into the dark corners of me that had stayed hidden for far too long. I didn't know what tomorrow held. But right here, right now, I'd taken my first real step out of the dark. And that was enough to start over. I woke up from the deepest sleep I'd had in years. No restless dreams. No sharp sighs cutting through the night from a man in the next room. Just quiet. Whole, perfect quiet. When I opened my eyes, it was already late. The city outside my window twinkled under a soft, midnight glow. But in this tiny room, peace settled in every corner like a warm blanket. I slipped out of bed, pulled on my cardigan, and padded into the tiny kitchen. It was barely big enough to turn around in, but somehow, it felt like I could finally breathe. No blaring television drowning out my thoughts. No complaints about underseasoned meals or misplaced glasses. I filled the kettle and traced my fingers across the smooth rim of the one thing I'd bought earlier that day, a simple white porcelain mug. No fancy patterns. No hidden cracks. Just sturdy and cool against my palm. And mine. The kettle began to hum, its quiet song filling the space with a warmth that didn't need words. I dropped a chamomile tea bag into the coupon old favorite I hadn't touched in years. Funny how even a forgotten scent can feel like coming home. Carrying the warm cup, I stepped out onto the little balcony. The city stretched out before me, lights flickering like the slow, steady heartbeat of something vast and alive. I took a slow sip, the soft bitterness melting across my tongue. For the first time in years, this cup of tea is just for me, not to wait for anyone, not to calm anyone down, not to please anyone, just for me. I leaned back against the doorway, my eyes tracing the night sky. The air was sharp and cold, but the steam rising from my cup curled against my hands, warming them slowly, gently. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. I didn't need to know what it held. All I needed was to know that tonight, I truly lived for myself. And in the middle of this wide, sprawling city, for the first time, my heart felt quiet, light, like the faintest curl of steam rising from my teacup, drifting upward and disappearing into the night, leaving behind nothing but the soft, lingering taste of peace. I finished the last sip of my tea that night, letting the faint taste of chamomile linger on my tongue. And just like every ending makes way for a new beginning, that night closed in perfect, unshaken silence. No arguments. No heavy sighs cutting through the walls. Just the soft hum of the wind, slipping through my cracked window whispering goodnight in a way no one had in far too long. When I opened my eyes, the morning light was everywhere, gentle, almost shy, like it was also trying to get used to me being here. For the first time in forever, I didn't jump out of bed. No blaring alarms. No Victor rummaging through the kitchen for his coffee with that familiar undercurrent of frustration. I just lay there, letting the sunlight brush over my skin through the thin curtains, reminding me I'm still here, still breathing, still have another day to figure it all out. My gaze drifted toward the window. There, on the sill, sat a little plant left behind by whoever lived here before me. Its brittle branches stood thin and bare, leaves long fallen away, forgotten, uncared for. It looked so much like me, just existing, surviving, standing through seasons of neglect and storms with no one stopping to notice. I got up, walked over, and crouched beside it. My fingertips gently brushed one of the shriveled leaves. It let go with the softest sigh falling quietly to the floor, like it had been waiting for someone to set it free. I sank down onto the windowsill, my fingers stirring the dry, cracked soil beneath it, whispering softly, almost to myself, "We all just need a little time, don't we?" And then, as if the universe wanted me to see it, I spotted it. A tiny sprout, barely noticeable at first, hiding beneath the dead branches. But it was there. A brilliant, fragile green. Alive. Hopeful. Right in that moment, it hit me. Even what looks dead can come back to life. If someone's just willing to open a window and let the sunlight in. I stood, reached out, and pushed the window wide open. The cool breeze swept in, carrying with it the scent of early November and shaking free the thin layer of dust resting on the sill. That morning light didn't just flood the room, it warmed something in me I thought had frozen over for good. And right there, standing barefoot on a cold wooden floor, I knew, even if I'm just a small, fragile sprout right now, it's enough. It's a start. I sat by the window long after I found that tiny green sprout. Something inside me had shifted, small but certain. Like sunlight crawling slowly across a cold floor, no rush, no pressure, just moving forward. That afternoon, I slipped on my old shoes and took a walk to the little park near my new apartment. My footsteps crunched softly against the gravel path. For the first time in years, every step felt mine. No one hurrying me along. No one judging if I was too slow. The trees stood bare and proud against a pale gray sky, their branches stretched wide and unapologetic, even without their leaves. At my feet, the last fallen leaves of autumn danced gently with each passing breeze, their soft rustling, a kind of quiet applause for simply being. I pulled my scarf a little tighter, tucking my hands deep into my coat pockets. And that's when I saw her. Laura. She walked with that same quiet grace, steadfast, unshaken, just like the day she walked into my life and reminded me how it feels to stand tall. She caught up to me and, without a word, looped her arm through mine like we were kids again. "Come on, Julia," she said, her voice low and warm, soft as sunlight, steady as the earth beneath my feet. I turned to her, a real, unguarded smile blooming on my face. "I don't know where I'm going yet," I admitted, my voice barely louder than the breeze. Laura squeezed my arm, her smile gentle but sure. "That's okay. What matters is, you're already walking. Standing still is the only real danger, Julia." And so, we walked. No destination. No maps. Just letting our steps carry us through the quiet of the afternoon, breathing in the promise that every single footstep meant we weren't standing still anymore. And in that simple, easy rhythm of walking alongside someone who believed in me, I felt it. I'm already on my way. And that right now, that was a beginning big enough for me. Every journey eventually needs a place to pause, to catch your breath and try on a new version of yourself. And I knew after all those wandering steps it was time to live inside something new, even if just for a day or a quiet afternoon. That's how I found myself standing at the gates of the nursing home, bathed in soft morning sunlight. A small name tag rested over my heart, declaring to the world that today I wasn't a woman hiding behind a kitchen door anymore. Today, I chose where I belonged, even if it was only for a little while. The breeze drifted gently through the long corridors, carrying with it the faint scent of peppermint. I clenched my hands, reminding myself this wasn't a place to run away from life. It was a place to remember the softer parts of me, the ones I'd left behind somewhere along the way. That's when I met Mrs. Helen. She sat near the window in a creaky old rocking chair, her eyes clouded but strangely deep, like they still held the weight of every season she'd lived through. I knelt down beside her, bringing my eyes level with hers, and gently reached for her hand-wrinkled, cold, yet still so full of life. "You're new here, aren't you?" Her voice trembled but carried a spark of humor. "Yes, today's my first day," I answered with a small, careful smile, afraid to disturb something fragile in her. She squeezed my hand firmer than I expected. "Your hands, they're so warm." I looked down at my hands in surprise. These were the same hands that once only knew how to grip the hem of my blouse in silence, the same hands that had gone cold through countless lonely dinners. And yet, here they were, carrying warmth for someone else. In that moment, something inside me clicked. Healing doesn't always start with grand gestures. Sometimes, it begins with something as simple as a hand reaching for another. No promises. No distant destinations. Just being here, in this exact moment, offering a little warmth and receiving the tiniest flicker of hope in return. I held her hand tighter, and for the first time in months, I felt my own heart rest easy. And I knew I wasn't lost anymore. I wasn't running. From now on, every step I took would be with purpose. With warmth, with my own two hands. After that first day at the nursing home, I came back to my small apartment, my hands still carrying the warmth of strangers' stories, tucked gently between my fingers. I realized I didn't need to do something grand to feel whole again. Sometimes, just sitting quietly, listening, and gently touching the forgotten corners of another person's heart, that was enough. That night, as the streetlights spilled broken patches of gold across my window, I opened the old suitcase for the first time since I'd left. There, tucked beneath layers of faded newspaper, lay a wooden box I had nearly forgotten existed. I lifted the lid. Scraps of fabric, in every shade and texture, piled haphazardly inside. Tiny squares once meant for handkerchiefs. Leftover pieces from that purple dress Victor had scoffed at all those years ago. And there one small square of floral fabric I'd set aside for a tablecloth I never finished, for dinners that never truly happened. My fingers traced each piece like they were fragments of my own life bits, and pieces of dreams abandoned, love misplaced, and hopes quietly folded away. The old needle and thread were still there too, waiting patiently for the day I'd have the courage to start stitching my life back together. I picked up a soft beige scrap, rested it across my lap, and carefully threaded the needle. My first stitches were shaky, uneven, just like my breath. But I didn't pull them out. It's okay, I can mend this, one stitch at a time. And so I sewed. Slow, steady. Every pull of the thread was a memory reconnected, a sorrow endured, a dream left unfinished, a kindness long overdue. In the quiet hum of that night, with only the soft sound of needle-piercing fabric and the wind whispering outside my window, I understood. Some wounds don't need to be perfectly patched. They just need to hold together long enough to remind you you're no longer falling apart. I kept stitching, not to finish a tablecloth or create something beautiful for someone else, but simply to remind myself, I'm still here. And tomorrow, when I offer warmth again, it won't just be through my hands. It'll be through the parts of me I've gently, patiently stitched back together. I must have fallen asleep right there at the little sewing table, the half-finished cloth still resting beneath my hands. When I woke, the morning light was already pouring through the window, painting soft golden lines across the fabric. The stitches were uneven, clumsy even, but I smiled. Because for once, it wasn't left unfinished, not like the rest of my life had been until now. Laura called around noon. There's a weekend market tomorrow at the square, Julia. Bring what you've made. Don't say no. Just try. Prove to yourself you've already begun. I hesitated. My fingers were still fumbling, my stitches still learning their way. And deep down, I was terrified. Who would want anything from a woman still learning how to sew her own life back together? But Laura didn't wait for my refusal. She never did. She always had this way of pushing me right past the edges of my comfort, even when I was still terrified to stand. So the next morning, there I was. At the weekend market. That old suitcase followed me again, but this time, it didn't carry the weight of leaving. It carried small fabric pouches, a few hand-embroidered handkerchiefs stitched in shaky lines, and little bundles of leftover thread tied neatly in twine. My stall was nothing more than a scrap of cloth spread across a rough wooden table, but as the first light of day fell across it, everything seemed to glow. Little fragments of memory come alive again. People pass by and wave, some stopping to glance, some not even slowing down. But I didn't mind. I sat there quietly, running my fingers over each item, feeling the faint warmth still lingering in the threads. And then she stopped. A young woman. She picked up a simple beige pouch, the one I'd stitched late last night. Her fingers ran over the uneven seams, her expression soft. These stitches, she murmured. It feels like someone's telling their story through them. clumsy, but honest. I swallowed hard. My words tangled somewhere behind my ribs. But in that moment, I felt my eyes sting. It turned out, people could see sincerity in the shaky hands of someone just brave enough to start over. Maybe I really can begin again. And in that bright, golden morning, I smiled. A full, genuine smile for the first time in months. Right there, amidst the noise and rush of the market, I found a quiet stillness inside me. This time, I wasn't standing in a crowd hoping to disappear. I was standing there, simply to be me. And for the first time, that was enough. That little beige pouch left my hands that morning, and with it, a small piece of the fear I'd been carrying for far too long. She disappeared into the crowd, and I sat there beneath the rising sun, light, unburdened in a way I hadn't known was possible, and I knew it was time to be braver, not just with needle and thread, but with how I saw myself. That afternoon, back in my tiny apartment, I opened the closet door, and there it was. The purple dress, the one I had once worn proudly, until Victor's cold voice settled over me like a wet blanket. That color doesn't suit you, Julia. You just look out of place in it. And just like that, the dress was folded away, buried beneath the weight of wrinkled house clothes and unfinished tablecloths meant for dinners that never happened. I reached for it now, my fingers smoothing over the creases etched deep into the fabric creases left by both time and memory. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, catching the purple fabric and making it glow. And without thinking, I slipped it on. It still fit. As if no amount of lost time had ever been enough to make me forget who I really was. I stood before the mirror. No one to judge. No one to wait for approval from. I turned slowly, the dress swirling gently around my legs soft and light, like the beautiful things I had almost forgotten I deserved. I don't need anyone's permission to feel beautiful. I already am, in my own way. And this time, the smile that rose on my lips wasn't the brittle smile of someone trying to endure. It was the smile of a woman who had just remembered, sometimes, all it takes is slipping back into something you once loved to remember you were never really lost. That evening, I stood on my tiny balcony, still wearing the purple dress, cradling a cup of tea as the city lit up beneath me. I wasn't waiting for someone to notice. I wasn't waiting for anyone's praise. I just stood there quietly, fully knowing that I deserved tenderness from myself, even in the smallest of moments. And for the first time in years, I felt beautiful, not because anyone told me I was, but because I finally believed it for myself. I stood on that balcony for what felt like hours that night, the soft folds of my purple dress swaying gently with the breeze. And for the first time in what seemed like forever, I wondered if beauty didn't have to come from someone else or from some far-off dream. Maybe it was right here, in the quiet acceptance of myself, just as I was, whole, enough. And when I finally pulled the curtain closed that night, I knew I wasn't the same woman I had been the day before. The next morning, the sunlight poured into the little apartment, bathing everything in its soft golden glow. And there it was again, my little plant by the window. I had nearly forgotten it since that day I found that tiny green shoot. But today, I stepped closer, crouching down to get a better look. My heart clenched gently at the sight right there. Between the brittle, lifeless branches was a sprout so green it almost hurt to look at. Tiny, brave, stretching toward the light without asking for permission or acknowledgement. Growing anyway, just like me. I leaned closer, my cheek brushing against the delicate new leaf, and for a moment, I felt held comforted by something unseen. I whispered softly, barely loud enough for the air to carry it. "You're learning how to come back to life too, aren't you?" My fingers pressed gently into the soil. This time, it wasn't dry and cracked. It was soft, warm, alive, and in that moment, I understood everything takes time. You can't force a sprout to grow faster, just like you can't rush your own healing. I opened the window wide, letting in the cool breeze. The scent of a new season drifted in fresh and clean, full of silent promises. That little sprout trembled gently in the wind, as if whispering back, "It's going to be okay. Just be patient and stay open to the light." And somehow, I knew it wasn't just that little plant learning to come back to life. I was too. I turned away from the window, sunlight still warm in my hair, and my eyes landed on the phone sitting quietly on the table. How long had it just sat there? No calls, no missed texts, no sudden rings to send my heart fluttering in that old familiar way. I found myself wondering how much had I let slip away while I was too lost in surviving to really live. And then, the screen lit up. Michael. His name burned across the screen like a forgotten song I thought I'd never hear again. My breath caught. My fingers shook as they hovered over the answer button. My son. My sweet boy who once held my hand through rainy days and playground scrapes, who had become a man I barely knew anymore, growing further and further away with every silent year in that cold, distant house. For the first time in forever, I answered, "Mom, are you there?" His voice, low, rough, a little cracked like he'd swallowed back one too many unspoken words. I took a deep breath, my voice barely above a whisper, as fragile as glass. "I'm here, Michael." Silence, long and heavy and full of the weight of all we'd left unsaid. Then, through the quiet, a soft, trembling sigh. "Mom, I'm sorry. I've been silent too long. I don't even know how to start." I leaned against the window frame, my hand gripping the phone like it was the only thing keeping this moment real. And the tear swarm and unstoppable fell before I could even try to hold them back. But this time, I didn't wipe them away. "It's okay, sweetheart," I said through the tightness in my throat. "You called. That's a start." I heard him break then. A soft, choked sound. And in that moment, I understood. Some bonds don't need to be fixed all at once. Sometimes, it's enough just to hear each other again, to know the line is still open. And that's all it takes to begin. I glanced out the window, back at that tiny green sprout dancing gently in the morning light. Smiling through my tears, I pressed the warm phone closer to my cheek and whispered, "I'm still here, Michael. I always have been." The call with Michael had ended, but his unfinished words lingered inside me like a quiet stream running beneath long, dried earth. And I understood every relationship needs tending, just like a fragile sprout needs a bit of sunlight and a few drops of water to rise again. So I told myself, keep going. Let my hands keep doing the simple things, stitch by stitch, no matter how uneven, no matter how clumsy, just don't give up. That weekend, I returned to the market. But this time, I wasn't lost in the busy crowd. My little booth was still nothing more than a scrap of cloth draped across an old wooden table. The simple things I'd made sat quietly there plain: fabric tote bags, a few hand-embroidered handkerchiefs, threads still uneven in places. But somehow, I wasn't ashamed of those crooked stitches anymore. Because now I knew each stitch told a story. Stories didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to be true. A stranger stopped at my table. He didn't rush to buy anything, didn't flick through the items like most did. Instead, he picked up a plain brown fabric tote, his fingers slowly tracing over every rough little stitch. He looked up at me, his eyes warm, soft with a kind of quiet understanding. "These stitches," he said gently, "they feel like someone telling their own story, unsteady but honest. And maybe that's the bravest kind of story there is." My breath caught. Sometimes you don't need 1,000 words, just a single look, a quiet sentence enough to make your heart tremble at being seen. I held my hands together, feeling the warmth of that moment settle into me. Yes, you don't need to hide the uneven stitches. That's how they'll know how brave you've been to keep sewing it all back together despite the breaks. The man bought the tote bag without asking the price. Before he left, he offered me a small nod, a soft smile that felt more like a blessing than a goodbye. I watched him disappear into the crowd, my fingers gently pressing against the fabric laid out before me. That day, I sold more than small, simple things. I let go of fear. And for the first time in a long, long while, I believed I was worth something again. Maybe I was stitching a new life for myself thread by thread, and with every stitch, a little more warmth, a little more quiet pride. I returned to my apartment just as twilight crept in. The small space still held the last traces of afternoon sunlight clinging to the thin curtains. The final tote bag I sold earlier still left a faint imprint on the tablecloth, a smudge of someone's touch, and I sat there tracing it softly with my fingers, as if feeling the pulse of the day that had just passed. I thought just for a moment that maybe I'd finally walked far enough that the past couldn't reach me anymore. But then the phone rang, that old familiar ringtone. And just like that, I was pulled backward down old streets, lined with rusted fences, back to that kitchen bathed in dim yellow light. Victor. His name flashed across the screen like a storm cloud rolling in. I froze. Half of me wanted to let it ring out, to keep this small, hard-earned world untouched. But the other half? The part that still waited for something I couldn't quite name. I answered. His voice was thin, almost translucent, faint. I had to hold the phone closer just to hear it. Julia, I'm not well anymore. A shallow breath. And then his words broke like glass falling to a cold tile floor. If you can, would you come see me? My hand tightened around the phone. My fingers trembled. But there was no anger rising in me. No bitter satisfaction like I once imagined I'd feel if this day ever came. There was only silence. A hollow kind of emptiness that echoed louder than any feeling I'd prepared for. Sometimes, the things we think we've closed the door on, they're just waiting quietly behind it for us to return, if only once, to finally say goodbye. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just hung up. Leaning back against the wall, I let the tears fall, warm and unchecked. Somewhere deep inside, a door creaked open one. I thought I'd locked for good. And there it was, the past. Still there, still waiting. And I knew sooner or later I'd have to go back. Not to begin again, but to lay it all down, once and for all. I sat alone in the dark for what felt like hours after that call. Outside, a soft rain fell, persistent, gentle, almost like the universe was quietly reminding me, some doors, no matter how old or broken, still need to be closed, by your own hands. But was that why I wanted to go back? Or was it just the weight of old habits pulling me toward the life I thought I'd left behind? The next morning, I stepped outside not to make any decisions, but to find out if my heart had one left to make. I met Laura at our usual cafe, and seeing her there so solid, so certain felt like finding a quiet shore in the middle of a raging storm. She saw me from across the room, but didn't call out. She just waited, like she always did, letting me find my way to her. I sat down, my voice raw as I spoke. Victor called me. Laura nodded slowly, her eyes calm and patient, waiting for the words I hadn't yet found the courage to say. He's sick, bad, and I don't know if I should go back. It tumbled out of me like it had been sitting there all along, waiting for this moment to escape. Laura reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her touch was soft, but there was steel beneath it. She didn't ask what I would do. She asked why. Are you going back out of love, Julia? Or because you're afraid of being alone? That question, so simple, yet so devastating, hit me like a stone dropped into still water. I squeezed her hand, searching for some excuse, some defense. But I knew, even before I spoke, that she had touched the deepest fear I hadn't dared to name. Was I really going back because love still lived somewhere in that old, battered house? Or was I just terrified that I wouldn't know who I was or where to go if I didn't return to the only life I'd ever known? Laura gave my hand another gentle squeeze, her voice low but sure. Be honest with yourself, Julia, because if you don't know the answer, going back will only make you lost again. I turned toward the window. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalk was still scattered with puddles, broken reflections of a sky trying to piece itself back together. And I understood before I could walk back into any part of my past, I needed to make sure I was carrying a whole heart, not one still torn and patched together by fear. Am I strong enough to return because of love, or am I just looking for a familiar doorway to hide under until this storm passes? This time, I stood up from the table without Laura needing to hold me back. But my steps felt lighter, because now I knew exactly where I needed to go to find that answer. No rushing, no running away, just a quiet search for the truth in my own heart. That afternoon, I didn't go straight home. I wandered the streets, under a sky that had finally cleared, past familiar corners, past quiet parks, their bare trees standing like silent witnesses to every question echoing in my chest. I walked until the sun fell behind the rooftops, and the night stretched itself wide above me. And still I didn't know. Should I keep going forward or turn back? That night, I collapsed into sleep without my usual cup of tea, without even drawing the curtains. The night air drifted through the half-open window, and the pale silver light of the moon painted soft patterns across the old walls. And somewhere in that restless sleep, I dreamed. A dream so vivid, it felt more like memory than illusion. I stood in a space filled with light boundless, endless. There was no beginning, no end. Everything shimmered with a kind of peace I had never known, like even the smallest speck of dust was humming a song only the soul could understand. And then, a voice. Deep and warm, neither man nor woman, but carrying a weight that settled right into the cracks of my heart. You're tired, aren't you, Julia? I couldn't speak. I only nodded, tears falling freely. No need to explain the ache I carried. You owe him from another life. This bond of husband and wife, this life it's the payment of a debt. But don't repay it in suffering. Pay it in compassion, in the quiet things done with a kind heart. The words wrapped around me like a blanket I hadn't realized I was cold without. When you fulfilled that bond with kindness, the thread will fall away on its own. You won't need to cut it. You won't need bitterness to break it. When love is complete, freedom will rise like a bird taking flight at dawn. I fell to my knees, lifting my face toward that brilliant light, torn between grief and a strange, trembling peace. But I'm afraid, I whispered, afraid of the pain, of losing myself again. The light softened, and it felt as if a hand gentle, unseen rested upon my bowed head. Only when you keep compassion without losing your dignity will you have truly grown. Not everyone can return. Not everyone can stay and not be bound. But you will learn. A soft breeze stirred through that eternal place, and the voice faded, a final blessing carried on the wind. Go now, Julia, and when your heart is quiet, you will know exactly where to rest. I woke just before dawn. Outside my window, the first birds were already cutting through the morning sky, gliding toward the rising sun. And in that still, golden moment, I knew the answer had come. No rushing back, no rushing away. Just wait. Let my heart grow still. And when it does, the path will be clear. Smiling through the soft sting of tears, I whispered to myself, quiet but certain, I'll go back, but only when I'm ready, when I can return with compassion and leave my old self behind. I woke from that dream feeling lighter than I had in years. It was as if the knot I'd been struggling to untangle had quietly fallen loose in the night. I wasn't running anymore. And I wasn't returning out of pity or fear of being alone. This time, I chose to go back simply to look my past in the eye and, finally, let it go. That afternoon, I found myself once again in front of the old iron gate. The faded green paint peeled away in places. The rusted edges felt familiar like the brittle, uneven years between Victor and me. Weathered, cracked, and yet still standing. The house sat in heavy silence, broken only by the slow, metronome ticks of the clock in the living room. I stepped inside, my feet soft against the worn floorboards, almost afraid to disturb the fragile air that hung in every corner. Victor lay in bed, the pale light of late afternoon stretching across his face in quiet streaks. The man who once walked through life so tall, so unshakable, was now just a faint outline beneath rumpled sheets. He turned his head toward me as I approached, and for the first time in years, his eyes, those same eyes I once knew, held no pride, no defiance, only surrender. His voice rasped through the quiet. "Julia, you're here. Can you forgive me?" I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hand gently covering his frail one. For the first time, I felt nothing heavy in my chest. No lingering resentment, no weight pressing me down. "I already forgave you, Victor," I said softly, my eyes drifting toward the window, where a tiny green sprout reached bravely toward the sunlight. "A long time ago, but I've also learned to keep space for myself. I'm still your wife, on paper, but in my heart, I choose to live a life of my own so that we both can finally find peace." Victor's eyes closed, and a single tear slid from the corner of his eye. There was nothing left to say, just the faint rustle of the curtain in the breeze, like even the air itself was relieved that the final words had finally been spoken. I sat there a while longer, my hand resting in his. No bitterness, no regret. Just two people who had lived long enough to know, sometimes letting go doesn't mean cutting ties. It simply means loosening your grip and setting yourself free. That afternoon, I left the hospital room with a heart lighter than it had been in years. I didn't cry. There were no bitter tears left to spill, no silent ache lingering behind my eyes. Just a quiet release, like the last door inside me had gently closed, with grace, without noise. But when I walked through the front door of my little apartment, the space that had cradled me through all my lonely nights didn't feel like home anymore. I stood by the window, watching the sunset spill over the streets I'd walked so many times in search of myself. And I realized something. Some places, no matter how much hurt they once held, will always be the places our hearts quietly call home. The next morning, I packed my old suitcase this time, not weighed down with sadness, but carefully filled with pieces of the life I had healed. The old iron gate creaked open just as it always had, the sound rising into the morning air like a familiar melody. I pressed my palm against the chipped paint, took a deep breath, and stepped through. The house stood just as it always had, dust gathering in the corners, walls in need of fresh paint. But my heart didn't feel heavy this time. I walked through every room slowly, running my fingers across the dining table, where cold meals once sat untouched, brushing my hand along the worn banister, where years of silent steps had passed. And strangely, I didn't feel sorrow anymore, only a quiet tenderness, like meeting an old friend you've long since forgiven. I threw open the old windows. Sunlight poured in, golden and warm, just like those early summer mornings I used to dream about. I'm home again, not to imprison myself in old wounds, but to live fully even here, in the place that once held my greatest pain, because now I'm strong enough to do it without losing myself. And for the first time, I knew. I hadn't returned to hide. I had truly come home. Not just to a house, but to myself. This return wasn't a cycle of pain. It was the beautiful, final chapter of a long, wandering journey toward peace. I threw open the old window and let the sunlight pour in, and for the first time in a long while, I felt my heart grow lighter, like the warm light wasn't just filling the room, it was finding its way into me too. And then, I heard it. The soft, familiar tap of a cane against the hallway floor. It brought me right back to all the years spent here, to all the things left unsaid. My mother-in-law stood at the doorway, smaller now, her frame more fragile, hair white and gleaming under the afternoon light. Her eyes, oh, those eyes. Deep, quiet, steady. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was making sure I wasn't just another passing shadow, but really there. Slowly, she stepped toward me, her hand resting on the windowsill where I used to stand as a young, uncertain daughter-in-law. She gave me a soft, almost teasing smile that felt both like a scolding and a welcome home. "You found your way back, didn't you?" she said, her voice thin but warm. My throat tightened. All those years, the unspoken words, the silent distances, and here she was, gathering it all into one simple sentence. I swallowed hard, my voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I'm home, Mom." She didn't say anything more. She just placed her worn, trembling hand over mine. "I'm old now, Julia," she murmured, her eyes looking somewhere far beyond me. "All I want for what's left of my days is to hear this house alive again. The sound of pots clattering, footsteps down the hall. This place has been cold for too long. And me, I'm not sure how much longer I can wait for it to feel warm again." My head bowed, shoulders trembling not from sorrow like before, but from the quiet weight of understanding. For the first time, I heard the loneliness in her voice. The woman I'd once thought was distant, cold, unreachable. She was just as human, just as fragile as me. I reached for her hand and truly held it for the first time. All this time, I thought the thread between us had snapped. But maybe it's been here all along, waiting for a gentle hand to pick it up again. And right then, I knew. I wasn't stepping backward into the life I left behind. I was stepping forward into something new. Softer, stronger, more whole than I'd ever been before. My mother-in-law drifted away down the hall, her figure disappearing into the quiet back of the house. I stood by the window, unmoving, letting the fading sunlight settle gently across the old wooden floor like honey poured slow and sweet. And then, a memory stirred. The little potted plant I'd long forgotten, the one I'd once left to wither in this very window, thinking it was nothing more than decoration in a home that had lost its warmth. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward it. And there it was. Between the brittle leaves and tired, gnarled stems, a single perfect bloom. Tiny, white, radiant. It trembled gently in the late afternoon breeze, as if it were whispering something I couldn't quite hear but my heart understood anyway. I reached out and touched one soft petal. Delicate, cool against my fingertips. Like the feeling of my own heart, learning finally to open itself to the fragile things again. You chose to stay, just like I did. That little flower hadn't demanded attention, hadn't cried out for care. It simply stayed, held on. And when the time was right, when the sun finally returned, it bloomed. Suddenly, everything felt so beautifully simple. Life, rebirth, it doesn't ask for permission. It just needs one reason, however small, to stay. Just like me. Just like her. Just like this old house, waiting patiently for the warmth to return. I ran my fingers along the cracked ceramic pot. The glaze was chipped, worn with time, but still sturdy, still strong. Much like my own heart. Broken in places, but never truly shattered. And in that quiet golden moment, I knew. This wasn't just about closing an old chapter. It was about starting new life right here, in the very place where I once thought love had dried up. Because somehow, without anyone noticing, spring had crept back in. And this time, I wouldn't miss it. I wouldn't miss my own season of bloom. I closed the window gently. The small white blossoms still trembled behind the glass, like soft whispers from a past I'd spent years trying to leave behind. That night, the old house fell into a stillness that felt almost sacred. No wind, No rustling leaves. Just the slow, deliberate ticking of the clock in the living room, counting out every heavy thought tumbling through my mind. I lay awake on the familiar bed, staring at the faded ceiling as the dim lamplight fractured into thin, broken lines across the cracked walls. I could hear my own breathing, deep and uncertain, as if I were trying to gather every last ounce of courage to answer the one question that wouldn't let me rest. Am I truly ready to stay? My eyes drifted toward the darkness beyond the window. From across the street, a neighbor's porch light spilled faintly through the blinds, its glow soft and hazy like old memories I'd convinced myself I'd outgrown, but never really did. And then, that voice from my dream echoed back, warm and clear as if the stars themselves were reminding me, when you fulfill your duty with a full heart, the bond will gently untie itself. I closed my eyes and sighed deeply, my chest rising and falling with a strange, new kind of surrender. And right there, in the hush of that moment, I understood something I'd spent years running from. Peace isn't found in distance. It isn't hiding out in quiet corners where no one can touch you. Peace is standing exactly where you once broke apart and not feeling shattered anymore. It's the kind of grace that asks nothing, demands nothing, and simply lets you be. I opened my eyes again, staring at the window where the blossoms swayed gently in the night breeze. Tomorrow I'll stay. Not just visit, not just try, but stay for real, because I'm finally whole enough to remain without losing myself again. Outside, the little flowers nodded softly, as if the night itself had accepted my vow. And I knew when the morning came, and that door opened again, I wouldn't be stepping back into my old life. I'd be walking into a brand new chapter, in the very same place. But this time, I was different. The night passed slowly, as if even the universe was holding its breath to see what choice I would make. And when the first light of dawn slipped through the blinds, I opened my eyes, with no hesitation. There was no more weighing of decisions, no more fear of regret. Just a calm, steady knowing light and effortless, as the breath I exhaled into the quiet morning air. I packed the last of my things from the little apartment. A few books. A half-finished stack of hand-embroidered napkins. That small wooden frame I always meant to hang but never did. It all fit neatly into my old suitcase. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. The wheels of the suitcase hummed softly down the hallway, and for once, the sound wasn't sad. It felt like music, like a quiet drumbeat marking the start of something new. When I reached the old house, the faded blue door stood waiting, the chipping paint glowing softly under the morning sun. The little plant on the windowsill caught the light just right, looking brighter, somehow more alive. I stepped through the door, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like crossing into a battlefield. It felt like coming home. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood and sunshine, and something else, hope. I stood there for a moment, right at the threshold, and felt it all of it. Not the pain of what had been, but the quiet peace of what could be. Coming home isn't giving up. It's knowing you're finally strong enough to stay and call this place yours again, but in a brand new way. I pulled the suitcase inside and began unpacking not just my things, but my heart. This wasn't a temporary visit. This wasn't about survival. This was me, choosing to live here. Fully, freely. Finally, the light poured through the old lace curtains, painting the cracked walls in warm gold. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about going back. It was about going forward right here, in this place. In this life, with nothing to prove, and everything left to feel. That morning, after tidying up the house, I realized something. The first thing I wanted wasn't to rearrange the furniture or scrub the floors spotless. It was to light the stove again. To bring the kitchen back to life, the one space that had sat cold and silent for too many years, filled only with quiet meals and even quieter hearts. I rolled up my sleeves and dug through the old kitchen drawers. There it was, the cast iron skillet my mother-in-law had used for as long as I could remember. In the pantry, I found just enough ingredients to bake a small apple pie, the same pie I'd once learned to make in secret, hoping just once to hear Victor say something kind. But that day never came. This time, though, I wasn't baking it for praise. Not for anyone's approval. I simply wanted this kitchen to smell like home again, like butter and cinnamon, and the kind of warmth that invites people to sit and stay a while. The scent was already filling the air when she appeared at the doorway. My mother-in-law. Smaller now, her figure a little more fragile, her white hair glowing under the golden sunlight that streamed in through the window. She stood there quietly, leaning on her cane, studying me with eyes that seemed to be searching for something, maybe proof that I was really here. Finally, she smiled, a soft, almost wistful smile that held both relief and something like forgiveness. "You still remember the recipe, Julia," she said gently. I looked up, smiling back without hesitation. Yes, I thought. Maybe today we could have a real meal. Not out of duty, not for anyone else, just for us. She took a slow step into the kitchen, her thin hands resting on the old table. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, two women stood in this kitchen together, not avoiding each other, not tiptoeing around unspoken words, but simply sharing a space and filling it with something tender and new. When the pie came out of the oven, the whole kitchen smelled like memory and forgiveness. She sat down carefully at the table, her frail fingers grazing the freshly cleaned porcelain plates. She looked at me again, her eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. "It's been a long time," she whispered, "since this kitchen smelled like home." I sat across from her and gently placed a warm slice of pie on her plate. And in that simple act, nothing else needed to be said. No long apologies. No recounting of old hurts. Just two women, side by side, tasting something sweet again for the first time in years. Sometimes love doesn't need grand gestures. Just a little butter, a sprinkle of cinnamon, and a quiet afternoon shared from the heart. Outside, the sunlight softened. Inside, the warmth stayed. And this time, I knew it wouldn't fade so easily. The pie hadn't even cooled when I heard it, the soft creak of the old iron gate outside. My breath caught in my chest as my heart thudded against my ribs like it already knew. My mother-in-law's hand found mine, her voice no more than a whisper, but full of quiet joy. "He's home, Julia." I stood, my steps slow but certain as the front door swung open. And there he was. Michael, taller than I remembered, broader somehow, but in his eyes, the same lost boy I'd held through thunderstorms and skinned knees. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. And then, without hesitation, he crossed the room and pulled me into his arms. A tight, desperate embrace. Like he was trying to make up for every silent year, every phone call not made, every letter never sent. I wrapped my arms around my son, holding him like I might never have the chance again. And for the first time in so many years, I cried. Not the silent, bitter tears of loneliness, but the kind that clears space, that makes room for something new. Michael's voice broke the silence, rough and thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Mom, for coming home." I held him tighter, my face buried in his shoulder, feeling his heartbeat against my cheek. Sometimes, all it takes is for one person to come home first, and the rest will find their way too. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight spilled across the front porch like liquid gold. And for the first time in forever, I had a home. Not just a house, a home. And people to love, fully, openly, without anything left unsaid. That afternoon, after Michael left, and the late sun stretched across our front yard like a soft farewell, I knew there was still one more thing left undone. Perhaps peace only truly settles when you're brave enough to touch the old wounds, knowing full well they might sting one last time. I walked quietly down the long hallway, toward the room at the very end. Victor's room. He lay there, his once proud figure now fragile beneath the thin bedsheets. His hair had turned almost completely silver, and when he saw me standing there, his eyes lit up briefly before fluttering closed, like he couldn't quite believe I was real. I sat down at the edge of his bed, but there were no storms in my heart this time. No crashing waves of anger or regret. Just calm. Victor opened his eyes again, his voice thin and shaky like a thread about to snap. "Julia, am I dreaming?" I smiled softly, shaking my head. "No, Victor, I'm really here." A single tear rolled down his sunken cheek, and his trembling hand reached out so fragile, I was afraid that if I let go, he might just disappear. I know how lucky I am that you came back," he whispered, his breath shallow and slow. Maybe I don't deserve your forgiveness. But before it's too late, I just needed to say it." He fought for one more breath, his gaze struggling to stay clear. "I'm sorry, Julia. Truly, I'm so sorry." I held his hand gently this time, not with resignation, not with bitterness or the desperate grip of someone afraid to lose again. Just with kindness. The kindness that comes from a heart no longer chained by hurt, but softened by understanding. Some apologies never arrive on time, but sometimes, just hearing them no matter how late's enough to let the pain finally slip away. I sat there quietly, holding his hand as the last rays of sunlight faded. Outside, the breeze grew cooler, and deep in my heart, I knew the season was changing. And within me, so was the weather. Night fell gently, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace settling over the house. It wasn't the cold, heavy kind of silence anymore. It was softer now. The sound of Victor's steady, even breaths drifted faintly from the back room. The soft tap of my mother-in-law's cane echoed occasionally in the hallway. And my own breathing. For the first time in years, it sounded calm. I sat by the window with my old journal open on my lap, the blank page glowing under the soft amber light. The pen moved slowly, my thoughts flowing as naturally as breath, each word a small release of everything that had once weighed me down. I didn't come back because I couldn't stay away. I came back because I finally learned how to love fully, right here, in the very place I once ran from. The lamp cast long shadows on the walls, but they no longer seemed like ghosts haunting me. They felt more like reminder proof that I'd walked through every storm and was still here, still standing. I closed the journal and looked out into the night. The stars glimmered in the dark sky, distant but unwavering like the dreams I thought I'd lost, now returning quietly, lighting up the darkest corners of my heart. Below the window, the little potted plant swayed gently in the night breeze. The tiny white blossoms seemed to glow in the soft moonlight. And right then, I knew. Peace doesn't live at the end of some faraway road. It's been here all along, waiting for me to be brave enough to stop running and call it by its name. Tomorrow, I'll wake up early. I'll brew myself a cup of tea. I'll throw open these windows and let the morning light pour in. No more running, no more hiding. I'm ready to stay. And that's enough for a lifetime of peace. Outside, the night air softened. And within me, a long journey quietly ended. And from that stillness, a new life was just beginning. I closed my journal that night, like gently folding away a storm-weathered map, knowing I no longer needed it to find my way. And just like that, the next morning, and every morning after, I began living a different kind of life right here, in this same old house. A life that didn't hide from memories. A life that no longer bent itself to please anyone else. Each morning, I woke early, threw open the windows, and let the sunlight flood in. The sound of birds on the rooftop played like a simple song of a brand new day. The kitchen was warm again. My mother-in-law no longer sat quietly in the shadows like she used to. Now, she'd settle herself gently on the porch, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, her eyes soft and peaceful, following the tiny green shoots pushing up from the garden. Even Victor grew stronger. Every morning, he'd sit by the window, his gaze distant but soft, resting on the little garden where, years ago, I planted rows of white chrysanthemums with my own hands. At the family table, the clink of dishes returned, the low hum of casual conversation, and every so often, the scent of apple pie warming the house again. No one spoke of the past, but in each glance, each small, easy smile, I knew everything had changed. One morning, as we trimmed the plants by the window, my mother-in-law placed her fragile hand over mine. She smiled faintly and whispered, "You've done it, Julia. Thank you for coming home." I squeezed her hand gently, my heart full in a way I hadn't known in years. So this is what peace feels like. Not grand, not loud. Just this watching a loved one smile under the morning sun, holding a hand that's no longer cold, hearing the quiet, steady breaths of someone who once broke your heart, and knowing you've stayed without losing yourself. The days drifted by, not bursting with joy, but no longer weighed down by sorrow either. Just quiet, steady days, like a cool stream running gently through cracked earth, softening the hardness, giving love a new place to grow. And I realized, happiness really is this simple. A warm kitchen with someone waiting for you at the table, a porch bathed in morning light, and a woman me who finally learned how to love without breaking herself in the process. I closed the window softly, my heart full and at peace. I wasn't just someone who'd come back anymore. I was finally home. The days slipped by quietly, without the weight of old sighs, without the cold glances that used to pass between these walls. This little house, with its chipped paint and faded corners, felt warmer now, filled with soft footsteps, easy conversations, and the gentle acceptance of people who had finally learned to forgive. That afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the front steps like silk, I walked into Victor's room. He was sitting up in bed, his eyes clearer than before, though his voice still trembled against the shallow rise and fall of his breathing. I brought him a small bowl of warm porridge, the kind of simple comfort food that filled the air with a quiet sense of ease. Victor looked at me for a long moment. This time, his gaze wasn't the hardened stare of a man who once controlled everything. It was the quiet, grateful look of someone who knew he had nothing left to demand, only gratitude for every moment someone chose to stay. His voice came out hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Have you really forgiven me, Julia?" I smiled softly, my eyes as calm as the breeze outside the open window. "I'm here, Victor, not because I have to be, but because I want to be, because my heart's big enough now to hold compassion without losing myself in it." I lifted a spoonful of porridge to his lips, gently, not with the weight of duty or sacrifice, but simply as a choice. A quiet, free choice. I'm here, Victor, not because I've forgotten, but because I've learned how to love without forgetting myself. Outside the window, the little white blossoms swayed in the breeze. And I knew, this time, my staying wasn't a chain. It was a freedom born from peace. And no one owed anyone anything anymore. We simply chose to be here, together. That afternoon, after Victor had fallen into a long, peaceful nap, I stepped out onto the porch. The late sunlight poured across the yard in soft, golden streaks. A cool breeze drifted through the garden, gently swaying the small, white blooms perched on the windowsill, the same little plant I once thought couldn't possibly survive another harsh winter. But there it was, alive, radiant, blooming with delicate, fearless grace. My mother-in-law sat quietly beside it, her frail fingers tilting the ceramic pot ever so slightly so the sunlight could kiss every tender sprout. I walked over and sat down beside her. No words were needed. She turned to me with a small, knowing smile, her hands trembling as they brushed over the fragile petals. "You did it, Julia. You found your way home," she whispered, her voice as soft as the breeze rustling through the garden. I didn't respond right away. My heart felt like a spring thaw pool, gentle waters finally flowing after a long, frozen silence. I reached out and gently took her aged, delicate hand in mine. "For the first time, Mother, I've come home without losing myself." She turned to me, and in her clouded eyes, I saw that glimmer of warmth and acceptance no words could ever fully express. In that quiet moment, we didn't need to revisit the hurts of the past or the walls that had once divided us. Two women, once strangers under the same roof, now sat side by side, watching a small, resilient flower bloom against all odds. Some relationships don't need to be stitched back together with apologies. Sometimes, all they need is the quiet presence of hands tending the same fragile thing and a shared silence that says, "I understand you now." The sunset poured its honeyed light across the porch, casting the silhouettes of two women once distant, now quietly whole against the fading day. And I knew, at last, love had found its way home. Not because it was obligated to, but because our hearts had finally become wide enough to hold it. The days passed, light and easy, like the soft white blossoms dancing outside my window. But I knew, when your heart has truly healed, love is no longer something you keep locked away behind familiar walls. It's something you carry out into the world, freely, proudly proof that you're no longer afraid of life. That Sunday morning, I carefully placed the hand-sewn bags, delicate handkerchiefs, and small table runners into my old wicker basket. But this time, I didn't pack hesitation. I didn't bring along the weight of uncertainty. The little stall at the corner of the market welcomed me back, with the scent of sun-warmed air, the lively chatter of vendors, and the kind, familiar glances of passers-by, some who had once stopped, smiled quietly, and touched the uneven stitches I used to hide behind. Today, I stood tall behind that stall, wearing the purple dress, yes, that purple dress, the one I had buried deep in the back of the closet after it was once deemed unbecoming. Now it hung on my shoulders like a banner of quiet triumph. The bags I'd sewn no longer felt like remnants of a broken past. They were whole, beautiful, and full of stories stitched together, not with regret, but with grace. More people stopped to linger, their fingers tracing the threads, smiling softly, as if they had found something rare and precious in a world that moved too fast. A little girl tugged at her mother's hand, her eyes wide and shining as I knelt to give her a small embroidered handkerchief adorned with a tiny white flower. She looked at me, her voice sweet and clear as a morning bell. "Miss, this looks just like the flowers by our window." I crouched lower, brushing the soft curls from her forehead, and smiled. Perhaps I, too, have become like that little flower, quiet, unassuming, and finally, blooming freely, without the need for anyone's permission. Sunlight filtered through the leaves overhead, falling gently across my shoulders. And in that moment, I knew I had truly come home, not just to the old house, but to myself whole, free, and radiant in a way I never thought possible. Happiness, I realized, wasn't about finding a place to belong. It was about standing right where you are and knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. After the market, I came home with a nearly empty basket, but my heart felt fuller than it had in years, full of something I hadn't known before, something that didn't need to be earned or proven. The house appeared beneath the soft glow of the afternoon sun, its red-tiled roof cutting gently against the clear blue sky like a familiar, tender welcome. And I knew today the kitchen would have its fire back. My mother-in-law was already sitting in her usual chair by the window. Her face, though tired and lined with the years, had softened into a peaceful, resting smile. Victor was up too, his eyes following me as I walked into the kitchen, those eyes no longer heavy with the darkness I once feared. I reached for the ripest apples left in the basket, my hands moving smoothly now, peeling them into thin slices, neatly laying them into the old pie dish. The scent of cinnamon began to drift through the kitchen, warm and nostalgic. The smell of butter melting into the apples, the faint spice of cinnamon curling through the air, it all wrapped around me like an old, familiar song. I stood before the oven, my hands busy, but my heart still and calm, like the surface of a quiet lake. The oven crackled gently, whispering like an old friend. And then, as the pie turned a perfect golden brown, and its fragrance filled every corner of the house. Victor slowly stepped into the kitchen and took a seat at the table. Victor, his voice rough but his eyes brighter than I'd seen in years. It's been a long time since I smelled that, the scent of home. But somehow it's sweeter today, isn't it? I smiled, carefully cutting the pie, placing each golden slice onto the fine porcelain plates my mother-in-law had always saved for special occasions. Maybe, when the heart no longer clings to anger, when old wounds have finally closed, even the simplest things become sweeter, even in the smallest of moments. My mother-in-law reached for my hand as I set the plate down. Her touch no longer trembled the way it used to. Her fingers were warm, steady, just like my heart now. In that little kitchen, no one spoke of the past, but in our glances, our gentle smiles, and in that small, fragrant slice of pie, I knew everything had come full circle. A kitchen that smelled of cinnamon, quiet laughter over tea, and a peace so deep it didn't need to prove itself anymore. And that was happiness, whole, present, no longer lost. That night, after the kitchen lights dimmed and the soft hum of my mother-in-law's quiet laughter faded into the night, and Victor rested peacefully in the back bedroom, I found myself alone again in that small wooden chair beneath the window. The moonlight poured through the sheer curtain, casting a soft, silver glow across the desk. I reached for the drawer I had avoided for so long, the one I promised myself I wouldn't open unless I was ready. The divorce papers lay silent inside, their creases worn soft with time, the paper yellowed like the faded edges of old regrets. I held the papers gently, my hands steady now, no longer shaking like the day I first scribbled my name across them through a storm of tears. Tonight, I could read every word and feel nothing but peace. Freedom was never meant to live in a signed document. Freedom is knowing your heart is no longer bound by old pain, that you can breathe without measuring every step against someone else's shadow. I folded the papers neatly, carefully, not to erase them, not to forget, but simply to close the chapter with grace. I placed them back in the drawer this time, not hidden away, but resting there like a reminder that I'd already walked through that storm, stood tall through it all, and found my peace on the other side. And this moment right here, this is my freedom. No signatures, no declarations, just me, finally free in my own heart. Outside, the breeze stirred the white blossoms by the windowsill, their fragrance rising into the night. I closed the drawer softly, my heart lighter than it had ever been. Because now, I didn't need to let go of anything to find peace. I could stay, I could care, I could love, and still be entirely, beautifully whole. And that is the most beautiful freedom a woman can claim for herself. That night, I closed the drawer quietly, without the old creak that used to sound like the weight of my own resistance. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept deeply, no waking in the middle of the night, no restless wondering about all the what-ifs. By the time I opened my eyes, sunlight had already poured across the room. Outside, birds chirped their morning songs, and the faint scent of yesterday's apple pie still lingered in the kitchen. The house was quiet, but full of life, like a gentle melody playing itself without anyone needing to conduct. I brewed a cup of tea and settled into my favorite spot by the window. The wooden chair creaked softly under me, but this time, it wasn't the sound of imbalance. I sat there, my heart as light as the clouds drifting lazily across the sky. I opened my journal and wrote slowly, the pen gliding across the page as if it too had found its rhythm. The words didn't have to be perfect. They just had to be honest. I paused, reading over what I had written. Today I have forgiven, and now I am free in my own heart. That was it. No grand declarations. No promises about a bright future. Just this truth, sitting quietly on the page. I closed the journal and took a deep breath, letting it out slowly as I watched the white blossoms dancing gently in the breeze outside the window. Maybe happiness was never meant to be a grand celebration. Maybe it's mornings like this, quiet, simple, with nothing owed to anyone, and no pressure to become anything more than exactly who I am. just living, and grateful for the chance to do it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and inside me, something quietly shifted. I had stepped into a new day unburdened, unforced, and maybe, just maybe, that was more than enough for a peaceful life. That afternoon, as the sun stretched long shadows across the porch, the soft chime of wind bells rang with the breeze. And then, the familiar click of high heels echoed gently along the stone path. Laura. She stood there by the gate, graceful and calm, her smile as warm as the last time we sat together at the cafe. But this time, her eyes held no worry, no hesitation, only the quiet certainty of someone who knew I had found my own way back home. "Think you've got a cup of tea for me, Julia?" she teased lightly, lifting a small basket of fresh lavender sprigs. I smiled and opened the door wide, no words needed between us. We sat on the porch, a pot of jasmine tea between us, its delicate scent mingling with the late afternoon breeze. Laura lifted her cup, her eyes catching the golden sunlight as she said softly, "This cup of tea, it's finally for you, isn't it, Julia?" I nodded, my lips curving in a quiet smile, my eyes warm and just a little wet with unshed tears. "And for you too, Laura," I whispered, my voice barely louder than the rustle of the wind. "Thank you for holding my hand when I couldn't even hold myself together." Laura only smiled, that knowing, gentle smile of a friend who had walked through storms alongside me and now stood back to admire the calm. We sat there in comfortable silence, our eyes drifting to the garden, where the white blossoms by the window swayed freely in the breeze proud, unhurried, beautiful in their own quiet way. Some people come into our lives not to promise forever, but simply to sit with us through the storms. And when the sky finally clears, they return, not to remind us of the struggle, but to share a quiet cup of tea with the version of us that finally learned how to stay and how to let go. The wind stirred the scent of lavender and jasmine, wrapping us in a soft hush, as if time itself had paused to let us have this rare, perfect moment. And in that simple afternoon light, with a hand that no longer trembled and a heart that no longer ran from its own quiet, I realized I already had everything I'd been searching for. After Laura left, she left behind a sprig of soft lavender and a teacup with nothing but the faintest scent remaining. I gently pulled the window almost closed. The golden afternoon sunlight streamed through the cracks in the curtain, settling softly onto the floor like a silk scarf laid gently over old memories. I rested my head against the window frame and quietly watched the little white blossoms by the porch. Their delicate petals swayed gently in the breeze, untouched by the harshness of the world, just like my heart now, no longer heavy with resentment, no longer restless with the need to become something bigger, louder, more. Outside, the rooftops had deepened to a dusky red under the fading light. Birds called to each other across the sky, their voices mingling with the soft sigh of the evening wind. My fingertips brushed a freshly opened petal, cool against the fading warmth of the day. Maybe this is all happiness ever needed to be. A blossom blooming right on time, an evening this quiet, and a heart that no longer feels the need to run away. The sky turned slowly from gold to deep violet. Clouds smudged across it like someone had gently stirred a glass of light and water. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of flowers and cool air, and whispered to myself, today I lived fully. And I knew if a day could end with such lightness in my chest, nothing more grand was required. Just the promise that when tomorrow's sunlight slips through these same curtains, I will rise again and say, I'm still here, still myself, and still at peace. After that peaceful afternoon, the night passed like a gentle sigh. No restless dreams, no heavy breaths beneath the weight of unspoken regrets. Only the soft rustle of the night breeze outside, and within me, a quietness so full it felt like grace. At the first touch of dawn, I opened my eyes. Without hesitation, I stepped to the window and threw open both panes wide, letting the cool morning air rush in. carrying with it the sweet scent of white blossoms. The sunlight poured into the room, warm and golden like a blessing whispered over this new beginning. I inhaled deeply, my chest filled with air so crisp it felt like I was breathing for the very first time. I'm still Victor's wife on paper, but in my heart, I've learned to love without chains, to forgive without losing myself, and that is enough, more than enough, for a peaceful life. Outside, my mother-in-law stepped onto the porch, a teacup in her hands, her eyes lifting to meet mine with a smile that said everything without a single word. Victor sat quietly just beyond, watching it all unfold through the open window, his gaze softer than I'd ever known it to be. I turned back to this familiar home, and for the first time, it all looked different, freer, kinder, whole. I relaxed my shoulders, smiled to myself, and let the morning sun flood every corner of the house that once knew only storms but now held nothing but light. Outside, the birds lifted their songs to the sky. Everything was just as it had always been. But me, I had changed. And that was everything.